Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I continue my exploration of the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program podcast series on hallmark number 7, third-party due diligence and payments. There's really no debate that the vast majority, some would say as high as 95% of all FCPA enforcement actions involve third parties. So this is viewed by the government as the highest risk, and it's something that companies must manage going forward. The FCPA guidance gives some thoughts on this, obviously, as it's important. The department says that you should utilize a risk-based due diligence, that companies need to understand the business rationale for including third parties in the business arrangement, and you need to have some form of ongoing monitoring. However, I would actually take a different approach. I break down the life cycle of third-party risk management into 5 steps, and I'm going to go through each of these 5 steps because I think it's important for you in the best practices program. So step number 1 is a business justification. Here, of course, the guidance says that FCPA guidance says that companies should have an understanding of the business rationale for including third parties in a transaction. Among other things, the company should understand the role and the need for the third party and ensure that contractual terms specifically describe the services to be performed. I break this step down further into 2 parts. You should first have a business sponsor who would identify, will be your primary contact for the third party within your company. This does a couple of things. One is it requires the business unit buy-in, but it also requires business unit accountability for the business relationship. The business sponsor will be your primary contact, both inbound and outbound, for information to the third party. The business sponsor should prepare a business justification. This should articulate a commercial reason to initiate and continue work with the third party. You need to determine how the third party will fit into your company's value chain and whether they will become a strategic partner or if this will only be a one-off transaction. The purpose of the business justification is to document the satisfactoriness of the business case to retain the third party. The business justification should be included in the compliance file and assembled every time a third party is given consideration for certification for acceptance and or recertification going forward. Step number 2 is the questionnaire. The term questionnaire is mentioned several times in the FCPA guidance. It's generally recognized as one of the tools that a company should complete in its investigation to better understand who it's doing business with. I believe that this is a key step going forward, but we've recently, within the past couple of years, run into a couple of situations where the questionnaire and the due diligence are perhaps a little bit less than lacking. Nevertheless, here are some of the basic questions I think that you need to consider in your questionnaire. Number 1, ownership structure. Here the third party should describe the nature of its ownership structure, its relationship with local, regional, and government bodies. If there are any people in the business, the third party rather, who are related by blood to government officials or politically exposed persons, it's also imperative that you obtain the identity of any ultimate beneficial owners, UBOs. 2, financial qualifications. What are the financial qualifications and financial stability of the proposed third party? Here you should obtain financial records audited for 3 to 5 years if available. Obtain the name and contact information for their banking relationship. Personnel. You need to determine the personnel who the proposed third party will provide to you and whether any of these employees are government officials. Make sure you obtain the names and titles of those who will provide services to you for your company going forward. Next, the physical facilities. Have them describe the physical facilities because this is a key indicia of whether they're a real company. You should probably going to have to check this, obviously, but what are the physical facilities they will utilize to support your business? References. I talked about banking references, but here you need compliance references. This means people who can attest that the company will do business ethically going forward. I suggest getting 3 and that you communicate with them. And finally, is the proposed third-party relationship have awareness of the FCPA, or do they have a compliance program in place? So do they have a code of conduct? If they do, you need to obtain and review their training materials and any relevant documents. If they've received training, who provided it, take a look at it. One thing you should keep in mind is you'll likely have pushback from any business member, business team member on asking these, but I can only urge you to stay. You must stay on this, and you must obtain this information. Step number 3 is due diligence. I think most compliance practitioners understand the need for due diligence to investigate this, but have struggled to how to define the basis of risk to perform the due diligence around. So what you need to do is take a look at the information provided in the questionnaire and in the business justification to set your level of due diligence. So if it's a low risk jurisdiction, perhaps you can get away with doing a level 1 due diligence report. For a higher risk or medium risk rather, level 2 due diligence would be an in-country database search. And then level number 3, which would, of course would be boots on the ground. After the GSK GlaxoSmithKline matter in China, companies have become more concerned that they cannot do adequate or what they thought was adequate due diligence going forward. That may be the situation in some countries. You may not be able to get the information out, Russia, or even some EU countries. So you need to consider that if you can't do the full due diligence or you can't get that information out, then you're going to need to try and put more robust management techniques around some of the other types of, or rather some of the other steps. Number 4, the contract. So the contract is going to be an important part of obviously any contractual relationship you have with a company, but your contract starts with your evaluation of the due diligence. You've got to determine whether or not what level of any red flags, have those red flags been cleared, and what's the effect of those red flags going forward. The evaluation must be in writing. It must be documented. It must be a way that a regulator who's looking at it can determine that you have taken a look at this and properly evaluated. Within the contract, there are several key components that you should try to get in every every contract from the compliance perspective. These include indemnification, which would be full indemnification for any FCPA violation, including all costs for underlying investigations. Cooperation, requiring full cooperation for any ethics and compliance violation. Excuse me. Material breach of contract. This means that if any FCPA violation is found, it's a material breach of contract, which means you could terminate the contract with no notice or opportunity to cure. You need to put the same obligations on any sub-vendors if you're going to allow a third party to hire them. You may actually just bar that. You absolutely positively have to have audit rights. So a key additional element would be the right to audit from the compliance perspective. But more than simply having audit rights, you've got to exercise those at some point going forward. You need to have a requirement for ongoing annual training. You need to have an requirement for annual recertification that the company or the third party has not violated the FCPA on your behalf. And then plan for a requalification. Step number 5. This is really where the rubber hits the road. This is management of the relationship going forward. So you've got to take some type of form of ongoing monitoring of a third-party relationship as a means of additional prevention and detection of wrongdoing. An experienced compliance and audit team must be actively engaged in both the home office and field activities to ensure that financial controls and policy provisions are routinely complied with and the remedial measures for violations or gaps are tracked, implemented, checked, and remediated. So what are some of the things that you should do? Well, you should obviously screen third-party records against trusted sources of data for any red flags that may arise, establish helplines and other open channels for reporting, investigate both on a routine basis and an audit and anything that might come up, analyze. Transaction monitoring has certainly become much more important, and indeed we just had a FCPA enforcement action involving Key Energy, where the Securities and Exchange Commission specifically delineated transaction monitoring as a key element of a minimum best practices and compliance program, and you should do this around your third parties. And finally, audit. I've mentioned that in terms of the contract provisions, but I'd re-emphasize that you have to have regular audit reviews and inspections of your third parties' anti-corruption compliance program, including testing and assessment of their internal controls. So third parties are generally recognized as your highest risk. This is where you may need to put most of your resources into. And let me just end with, you've got to document everything you do. So this is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program in the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.